Good
think we're
evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Urban Files, where your hosts, Chuck and Max, discuss the latest news and developments related to cities and urban development, how we live, work, and play in cities around us. So, Max, Santa was very good to me this year, and given my passion for cities, I was able to get a couple really cool things. And I mean, my translation there, I'll mention family members and my wife too there, but anyways, I got this book, Market Urbanism, and it is basically a vision for free market cities. It's by Scott Beyer. So, of course, both you and I are part of the Facebook group, and it kind of got me thinking, where are some of the best places to learn about cities on the internet or just in general? So, I guess I'll start kind of talking about his site because it's such an interesting paradigm shift. I think when you really think about cities, the whole idea of an urban entity is kind of one that is more central planned and kind of has more of a central source of power that's dictating things and how things are laid out. And this is a spin in the opposite direction of that. And what it's saying actually is that the best cities come from potential free market economic solutions, that there's bottom up solutions to this. And that's the whole theme of the Facebook group that we're a part of. There's around 15,000 members, I think, or something. It's one of the more active groups related to this topic on Facebook and on the internet. And so it's interesting because, you may not necessarily agree with all of his points, and he does have a tendency to troll his audiences from time to time on certain things. But he really does do a good job of conveying, potential need areas or service areas, in housing shortages and everything, and how a lot of times there's redlining in cities that is done by both political parties, kind of an apolitical thing. And he does a really good job of explaining his vision for making them more livable through potential private market solutions. So, Max, what are your thoughts? I know you've been in that group some also.
Yeah, I remember when I first came across that group, and then I shared it with you. I remember sharing it with you very soon after I discovered the group. So I didn't really know what I was sharing with you. I just knew that this was something that seemed really interesting to both
Yeah.
of us, I figured, and it was
Yeah.
growing incredibly quickly.
Yeah.
And so I remember that time when I shared it with you, and I was thinking, I don't know if he's going to like this. I don't really know what it is myself, but I think that this is sort of right up our alley. And I do really appreciate the conversations and discussions in that group. I don't necessarily buy wholeheartedly a lot of the stuff that's presented, and there's certainly a lot of debate in that group as
Yeah.
well. I think you've observed many times that Scott really puts thoughts out there that he thinks will generate argument.
Debate, yes, very much so, yes.
And that's probably one reason why how he grew so quickly. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of interesting ideas and discussions that come from that group, and it's definitely a place where I like to just see different perspectives and new ideas.
Yeah.
Even though a lot of times I don't agree with different things that people are saying, whether it's from Scott and his admins or whether it's from others in the group. But it's definitely full of interesting people, characters, and ideas.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I mean that's a good starting point. I have to say it's funny, you bring up Christmas and how you thought of all of this for us to chat about today, because uh, normally we have sort of topics for us to do on the show, kind of percolating for a while. Maybe we'll mention it to each other a week before, a couple weeks before, and kind of like pencil in what we're going to talk about. And this actually came about like within just minutes ago. And so
It was a stroke of inspiration,
yeah,
Yeah.
and it's certainly something, the topic being, where we find inspiration for some of our urban planning topics and so forth, the thought leaders, the influencers in this industry, in this space. It's obviously something that's somewhat on our minds most of the time
Yeah,
by
yeah.
nature, but I'm just scared as we talk about this now. I'm scared that I'm going to be omitting, since I haven't spent any time thinking about this before we went live. I feel like I'm going to be omitting some important people or just overlooking stuff. So
Yeah.
I'm a little bit nervous as we talk, but sure, I'll throw out some things. I guess the first place that comes to mind that you mentioned to me earlier before we went live, and I guess is really important to me, and is Metro Jacksonville. It's a website, it's a community, and for me it's very important because I feel like it was very instrumental in sort of cultivating my interest in this topic. I discovered the website around 2007, and I wasn't living in Jacksonville at the time, but it was sort of a way for me to connect with my hometown and know about the things that were happening there. And it was also, I was in grad school for music, and I was developing such a love and passion for this topic that while I was in grad school for music, I was seriously researching and looking up going to grad school for urban planning, sort of concurrently as I delved into the website. It's such a great wealth of information for just self-learning about sort of the history of many different cities, and how transit has affected the growth patterns in many different cities, for example, just one topic. And I learned a lot on my own just reading through the sort of archives on that website. But at the same time, it's also sort of a real-time forum for people, mainly in Jacksonville, mainly focused on Jacksonville back then, to talk about things that were happening, currently in the city. And so I was sort of applying on one hand, just learning a lot about sort of the subject matter, looking at what had happened over many years and many examples from around the country. And then at the same time, also talking to people about stuff happening in Jacksonville. So shout out to Metro Jacksonville, and also its sister website. I'm blanking. What's the other site?
Modern Cities, right? Modern
Yeah.
Cities, yeah. And that's kind of a more broad approach to looking at urbanism in general. It's kind of their spin-off site. So both are really worthwhile.
Yeah. So if you're not wanting to just focus on Jacksonville, want to learn more about cities in general, Modern Cities is sort of the sister website to cover news of from all over the country and the world as well, maybe. So Modern Cities is the first one to pop.
Yeah, well, and your love for Jacksonville is evident. In fact, it's really even evident right there behind you on that little map there. So that's kind of cool.
It's a 2009 downtown vision map of downtown Jacksonville, and Chuck, you were just asking me about it before we went live, and this was for me to like visualize and understand downtown Jacksonville when I first moved back to Jacksonville 13 years ago, and kind of understanding what was happening block by block. I wrote a lot of notes on there, and it's really weird now to see this like frozen in time from 13 years and what was happening, what I was thinking about then. Yeah.
And it's cool to see your story there and kind of how you've grown up there through that time and everything. And, of course, I don't really have a real relationship with Jacksonville other than, sending Jaguars memes to you and all that stuff. But, really having the chance to have Ennis on our show, he was, it was great for him to come on and really, getting to read the content that he and Bill have put out. It's impressive, and it's impressive even if you don't have a connection with Jacksonville or North Florida. I recommend especially some of their photo essays on modern cities. But going beyond that,
just to explain, like you mentioned Ennis. Ennis was on our very first podcast and our very first show of the Urban Files, and he's a co-founder of both Modern Cities and Metro Jacks. So.
Yeah. So there's a personal connection there with that too. I would say, looking at what they offer, it's kind of a lot of bigger cities. It's kind of an envy, in terms of like because, well, Jacksonville, of course, has some things that it's working on in urbanism standpoint, like Lenny's Landing and all of that. I'm familiar with that now. So, but in terms of a source for kind of like crowdsourced journalism that's truly local and focused on this stuff, there's a lot of cities that don't have something like this. I mean, I know Tampa has a few sites, but it doesn't seem to be like there's one exact source that's like really has like a true community forum for things. So it's really great that they have them out there as kind of a voice for the city.
Yeah, I think the community aspect that you're talking about, community voice, that's the key. I mean, it's not just a news source. It's not at all just a news source, because plenty of cities have those. Especially you go like Biz Journal and all that for each city. Mm-hmm. But the fact that Metro Jacks provided a very large and very active community of people and city advocates and planners and people who were involved with what was happening in the community. That's a very interesting element that I guess isn't in most cities. However, that brings us to like a website that is sort of a community for all kinds of folks from all over the world, and I think is another very important place to mention for us. City data. I think it's city-data.com. Is that right?
Yes. Look. That's correct. Yeah.
Yep. City-data.com. A lot of members, I think, just call it CD.
Yeah.
So that's actually the website where you and I met.
Yes, and actually, I believe it went viral recently. I don't know if it was the Atlantic or somewhere like that actually talked about people have been debating which cities are better for 12 years now. Which, I mean, you think we would have figured that out after the first few years, but here we are. We're still going. But yeah, it's basically almost like a Reddit for those of you guys that are maybe a little more familiar with that. But it's a Reddit that's specifically themed around different cities. And each city, I mean, maybe this is somewhat, in this case, true for Reddit too, but it kind of has like an urbanism focused bent. And each city and state has a few forums or sub-forums that are related to those topics. So if you've ever been in an internet forum before, you kind of have the idea or the energy there, but it's a very fierce energy there. People really are diehard about their cities. And there's a passion for this kind of stuff that you would not believe if you weren't really familiar with this topic.
Yeah, you get to know certain characters that are very, very pro, XYZ city, whatever.
Yes.
That guy is always going to just like pump up that place. And then if you talk bad about it, they're going to show up. They're going to find it and they're going to show up and then they're going to argue with
absolutely.
This other guy.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just like in that same way, you're right. It's just like, it's a lot like Reddit. I think it's not a monolith. The community is not a monolith. There's plenty of people who are just rah for whatever hometown or so.
Yeah.
And then there's also haters. There's people who are like very anti whatever city. And then you have people, I think, that take it who like to dive deeper, who like to take things, to analyze things more carefully. Maybe that's how you and I found each other.
Right. Well, there's a little more nuance there, right? And you meet some really talented people in there in terms of the level of detail that they're willing to provide. People from Philadelphia and San Francisco, and people that are journalists actively, people that are working for the Census Bureau. So really thought leaders that you're just kind of getting a chance to engage with. There's just kind of an anonymity behind it, of course, because you're not really actually, in most cases, getting to really talk to these people. So it's an interesting place, and so that's, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that as an important site there.
Especially that's where we met.
Exactly. Yes. So switching gears, this is a little bit of a stray from urbanism, But because her guides focus so closely on cities, I think it's something that really probably should get more attention, especially if you're into cities and you're specifically into the architecture and kind of like the placemaking that's found there. But Virginia Duran, she's an architect that's in London, and her site, I'm not quite sure. I think it might even be like Virginia Duran, like WordPress or whatever. But she posts incredible city guides. She has one for Miami, Paris, I mean, dozens of European cities, at least I'd say probably a dozen North American cities are on there, and it's in one Puerto Rico's on there as well. And when you read this, it's probably the most in-depth, detailed guide about places in a city you've ever seen. I mean, she'll have 15 pages of buildings. And because we all kind of like rankings, I mean, if you're probably watching this video still, you probably like rankings or like cities and all that stuff in general too. So, you know, she has like 5-star buildings that are must see, and then 1-star that are kind of just okay that you might see if you're in passing, kind of that priority order, which is appreciated there. And I guess as I'm kind of sitting here thinking about this, if you have any thought leaders that we missed, because I'm sure there are many, drop us a thought in the comments. We may even make another one of these at some point to kind of like discuss some other people that we just for some reason didn't mention tonight. So anyways, we'll keep it going, Max. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I know you love her. You've mentioned her many times, especially when you come to visit a city. I think Miami, right? Whenever you come to Miami,
The Miami one, yeah. I mean, and it's because it's so close, right? So like that's a 3.5 hour trip for me. And so even if I'm just down for the day or a couple of days, I tried to catalog on Google Maps
yeah,
specifically where would be a high priority visiting building to check out. That's actually how the Brickell Arch building, I learned about that way. I learned about South Point Park, which is a beautiful spot in the Miami waterfront in that sense. So it really just enhanced my knowledge and profile and understanding of architecture as a subject, and also really of what are some really cool places to check out within any city anywhere.
yeah. Okay, I'll take this to podcasting.
Yeah.
And so there's a couple that I'm going to mention. There's a podcast. So the tough thing, and this is part of the reason why we decided to start doing our podcast, is that this isn't a very large, niche podcasting about urbanism, and there's a few podcasts that I've followed very, very loyally, but they don't seem to stay on that long. So so the ones I want to mention, first of all, there's the Best Cities podcast, and this was very short-lived, but I feel like I should mention it because it was produced by Resonance, which is a consulting company that we refer to very often, and a company that we admire quite a bit. And so they briefly did a podcast. I think they only have like 3 or 4 episodes, but I really enjoyed the ones that I listened to, the ones that they put out, because I listened to all of them. And then the other podcast I want to mention is called Transforming Cities, and there's actually quite a catalog. Transforming Cities has two seasons, I believe, and I don't know if they're planning to continue on or not, but they've been on a hiatus for a year or so it's been a while. But Transforming Cities is a really good podcast, produced by Authentic Form and Function, which is a real estate development marketing consulting kind of company. And so they would have people on the show who were transforming cities, who were doing something major in a particular city. And so oftentimes that would be real estate developers, not your typical grandpa's real estate developer, but people who are really being innovative and trying to change the industry and innovate and
disruptive kind of, yeah.
And there's a lot of really inspiring stories on that podcast. But it wasn't just developers. They'd have all kinds of people who were involved in sort of reshaping the physical environment in cities around the country. So yeah, I highly recommend that podcast, and I hope that they'll be producing more episodes in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that sounds really inspiring, and it sounds like a really cool focus that, again, it's kind of almost like a niche within a niche. It really has a cool way of presenting things. And I was unaware that resonance. I mean, I obviously had been watching some of the things, but I had never really looked into the Best Cities podcast, but I'll have to check that out now too. So I appreciate both of those. Actually,
there's only a few episodes. I was excited the first time I saw it. This was like a few years ago, but it didn't last very long.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. Hey, well, it's worth a try, right? Maybe they can reboot it if they have some demand. But I'll be honest with you, in terms of podcasts, I don't really go to specific podcast platforms that often. I spend more of my time with cities kind of watching, YouTube channels or creators. So Dave Amos, who's actually a UC Berkeley, I think doctoral student or graduate in urban planning, created one called City Beautiful. And if you haven't seen it yet and you like cities at all, it's amazing. Or even if you just have a casual interest, it kind of talks about why, I think what his most watched video, which is ironic for an urbanism channel, is why are there so many cul-de-sacs, right? So that kind of speaks to that. But I mean, like, there's several videos about Disney's urban development and kind of their private government and stuff, and he really focuses it from that angle. So it's just really an interesting channel for, I think on his premium account, there's like a history of ancient Rome and how they planned out. So there's really some cool stuff if you have an interest in this kind of stuff. Another one.
Yeah, I love City Beautiful. I just want to jump in. I love his channel, and I would say he really he specializes. I don't know if I should.
Yeah, well, he's an urban planner, so I think he has like a savviness to be able to bring to the table specifically that a lot of us may not necessarily be able to.
He's perfect for YouTube in that I think he takes his expertise in urban planning and presents it to the masses in a very sort of digestible fashion.
Yeah.
He takes sort of things within that field, urban planning, that might be a curiosity of just regular folks.
And
so I can see why he's so successful and has such a popular channel, but two, he does really a good job of breaking down interesting subject matter that I think most people would be curious about.
Yeah, and I'd agree. That he does a great job there. The other YouTube channel I want to shout out is the B1M, and that again is it's actually more focused on architecture, and it's specifically actually more focused on like construction and development from that standpoint. And so their most recent thing, I think, was about Billionaires Row in New York City and kind of the making of that, and kind of like how it's kind of become almost like a white elephant in the land that's been taken up there, and how many people aren't even living in them. And so there's kind of controversy around that, whether they should add a land value tax. So really just looking at that recent development there from a number of angles. They also had a video recently, I think it was like how to fix Dubai by 2040. And so, if you're familiar with these circles, I think there was one kind of viral video, I don't remember the exact creator name, something about Dubai as a parody of the 20th century or 21st century or something like that, and kind of talking about the just urbanism and the negative aspects that are found there in terms of development. And this platform, I haven't watched it yet, but it really seems to go into some practical solutions and how Dubai can become more walkable, kind of less pedestrian hostile, and kind of like some solutions, because there's things that are going for it there, but what can be done to kind of improve the overall product over the next couple of decades. So again, really a construction focus. It talks about like, airport development in cities and all that stuff too. So just really insightful if you're into like construction or that type of infrastructure projects.
So you said that's the B1M?
B1M, yes.
Yeah, okay. I had not heard of them before, but their channel looks really interesting.
Yeah. So, hey, we're
Yeah,
both learning things here, so that's good. Good.
yeah, awesome.
So,
So spinning off of going back to what you said, Dave Amos and City Beautiful channel. I have a connection to Dave, even though I've never met him, and that's
interesting.
that he is a Vanguard fellow, a Next City Vanguard scholar. Like,
Wow, okay.
um, and I was really hoping I'd get to meet him at the
Yeah.
conference we had, a few months ago, but yeah, apparently because of COVID, a lot of previous
People
alumni
miss,
did not attend. But I just mentioned that because that takes us to websites and blogs and so forth. And Next City is definitely one of my go-to sources when it comes to news and information.
Yeah.
A news and information website.
Yeah.
They cover a lot of great topics from cities around the country, and I would say, I mentioned this before. Next City is definitely about like advocating for equity and justice in cities in the context of like our urban spaces,
Yeah.
and so their website is more than just news about this happening, real estate development and what have you. Theirs really goes several levels deeper, and so a lot of times when I'm skimming headlines, it's not so much like with other sites where I'm like, oh, that's an interesting thing that's happening that I didn't know about. A lot of times the headlines are, wow, that's an interesting thing that I just never imagined, never even thought about. It's not like ABC is happening in this city. It's always like
Right.
much more just next level kind of thinking about the
Yeah.
issues at hand. And so yeah, it's always sort of expanding my mind.
Yeah, I need to check out this site more. I mean, I'm most familiar with the conference, but it sounds like you really get a lot of insight and detail from, looking in there, and numerous things, both about social development, but also just about ideas in general. So that's awesome. One that I'd say from a website standpoint that I like to peruse really anywhere I'm traveling to a new city, and kind of just, this is more from a best place to eat, best place to go, like for nightlife, best place for events that are happening, is Time Out. I mean, I think at one point I would have said Thrillist, and I don't mean to hate on Thrillist at all either, but I would say Time Out just has just a broad focus, and it stems to really giving you some creative ideas for such a vast number of cities that you're potentially likely to go. They have a list that's probably most well known for. It's, I think, like the 40 most hip neighborhoods in the world that we've talked about on here, I think, before, about some of the ones. And what I like about that list is it kind of has an equitable focus. I like that they actually mention neighborhoods and cities from like the AMEA, the Africa, Middle East, Asia, that a lot of times don't get a lot of press or play by Western sources, and they change up the list every year. So it's not meant to be just some objective, okay, these are the most consistent year-over-year happenings. Like, okay, there's some cool stuff happening here, so maybe go check this out. Now, is there some advertising revenue that might go into getting those? Maybe, but I like seeing new neighborhoods get focused on anyways. And one more cool thing that Time Out does is they actually have a Time Out market where they specifically kind of handpick some popular local vendors and put them in. So it's kind of a who's who of some of the city's most happening foodie spots that's already present there. So they do a number of cool things, and it's a really cool site whenever you want to figure out what's happening in your city or anywhere else.
So the last thing you mentioned, the timeout market, you're saying like on the website they do that?
So no, this is actually a bricks and mortar thing. So Time Out market, like I think actually there's one even in your immediate former neck of the woods in Miami Beach. So Time Out market, Miami Beach. I think there's a Time Out market in Lisbon, Portugal. I believe there are a few other bricks and mortar ones like that,
So
but I haven't gotten to check them out.
I've actually been to the one in Brooklyn.
Okay.
That's probably that was my introduction to it.
Yeah.
And then I see some in like Boston, Chicago, Montreal, and Lisbon, as you mentioned, and there may be more. So I just wanted to clarify that I wasn't.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. Yeah, because that's actually something that you as a tourist can check out in a number of places. I have not been to one yet, but I would definitely like to.
Yeah. Cool. I was right with you on timeout. We've obviously mentioned them a few times on our show. I would also mention Curbed.
Yeah.
I don't know how active they are now, but that used to be one of the places that I would frequently check out.
Well, they I think had a YouTube channel kind of fusing this together here, and I think it was Curbed, and it was about like the history of a street, and they had like an 18-minute segment that described like the most influential street in certain cities. I think in Chicago they might. I don't know which ones they actually picked because I'm not able to see right now, but they had a number of videos that were like just like a history of a street, and it had like the development of it, the style, everything else. I think it might have been like 6th Street Austin was one of them, and just kind of capturing that city on a micro level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have I feel like they're a marriage between Next City and Timeout. So they have a lot.
Yes. Oh yeah. I agree.
Sort of the pop, superficial kind of, this is what's happening. Check this out. Kind of events based,
but also kind of creating meaning there. Yeah.
But then they also do touch on important topics. I shouldn't.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, I mean, that's another go-to for me. Curbed. And I don't know. I have a few other websites I could mention, but maybe we'll we'll move on before we make the list too long.
Well, that's the thing, right? And there are, I'm sure, like there's hundreds of probably really good websites out there. These are a few that just absolutely stood out to us as our favorites and kind of regular places that we spend some time when we're looking to learn about this area. But hey, I mean, again, if you guys want to interact with us in the comments, or even, I mean, this one wasn't a ranking, but if we want to do like an NCAA tournament type thing here at some point, I'm game for it. So hopefully you guys enjoyed and got something, or we'll check out one of these sites and find some.
Well, real quick, last thing. I think you wanted to maybe talk about some thought leaders and authors.
Okay, yeah, so we can do that. So I would say, I think you had someone in particular in mind, right?
Well, okay. I mean, if we're gonna go there, Richard Florida, is that who you're?
Yeah.
He's more or less sort of my. I don't know. I would say I'm I would call myself a pupil, a disciple of Richard Florida. I really just consume everything he puts out and more or less take it as sort of my
that's your gospel. That's kind of like
first point.
Yeah. Okay, so he's kind of a very important leader there. I'm trying to like think, because I mean, obviously, like when you mentioned that, I was kind of trying to rack my brain for kind of that divide, right? Because when we're talking about a thought leader versus an influencer or content creator, I mean, like I'm thinking like Jane Jacobs, of course, going way back, would be kind of a major thought leader in the history of urbanism. But thinking right now, I think Richard Florida is probably about as big a voice as there is. But there's definitely some other major authors and stuff. I know, like one of your favorite books was Walkable City, right? In terms of
Jeff Speck.
He's.
Well, it's funny that you say that, because I'd seen, I've listened to Jeff Speck, I've seen excerpts, but I had not actually read the book until
Okay.
2 weeks ago, which is when
Wow.
I,
Wow. Okay.
yeah. So that was when I actually read the entire book,
Yeah.
and uh, and I finally understood, I guess, why it's such a landmark kind of piece of reading. It's he really does a great job of laying out case, step by step, the importance of walkable cities, and how to create them, how we should focus on those elements. And it's just funny because so much of the subject matter in his book is stuff that we talk about on
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
very, very regular basis. But it was another thing to really see the big picture of how he was laying out everything, and essentially, I think, doing a pretty good job of speaking to people who aren't us,
Yeah. Yeah.
his audience being more just like people who don't think a lot about this stuff,
Yeah. Yeah.
and kind of getting an introduction into why it's important and how we can do it, um, without too much difficulty, how we can kind of change the trajectory of a lot of our cities.
Makes sense. Yeah. Well, and obviously his contributions are very significant. I actually almost had a chance to be at an event he was at in St. Petersburg a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, it did not work out, but he's definitely a great source there. In thinking about it and kind of racking my brain while we've been talking about this, I did think of a couple people that I think potentially fall into that thought leader category. Chuck Moran, who's ever at Strong Towns, he is kind of an interesting voice because we talk so much about cities, but his focus, again, as you say about spec, is kind of to appealing to the thoughts of urban solutions, but not necessarily urban solutions in New York City, but what can be done to incrementally improve urbanism in, say, rural Minnesota. I don't know exactly which town he lives in Minnesota, but I know that's actually where Strong Towns is based, not in DC or not in one of these major, corporate, like government centers or anything like that. So it's just an interesting vision for that, and kind of the mathematics of urbanism, and kind of like what can be done to make our cities a little better. I think I read an article about why it's good that Trader Joe's parking lots are smaller. So kind of picking up those, average Joes that are just kind of looking to learn a bit more about the subject. Another person I was thinking of was Enrique Penalosa, who he's one of the more notable city mayors recently. He was the mayor, I think a two-time mayor of Bogota, Colombia, and one time was during the 90s and then again later in 2010s. And for those of you guys that aren't super familiar with this subject, Bogota, of course, Colombia being more until recently known as a haven for higher, drug crime and poverty in recent decades. And the city itself was really kind of in a poor state a few decades ago. And he led a number of initiatives in public spaces that kind of drew people back to the center. He introduced something called Ciclovia, which is like a public Sunday from about 12 to 3 p.m. each week, where the roads close. And I think 500,000 Bogotanos, hopefully I got that right, kind of cycle around the city center in about 20 miles of open streets where it's closed to cars, and kind of like creating that civic space, kind of really also that thought about kind of creative solutions to urban problems. I think there's a number of insights he had from that, and also introducing, really kind of popularizing bus rapid transit, especially in the developing world, but especially, probably worldwide, but especially in Latin America as a creative solution. The Transmilenio bus, that it was specifically called, really was influential in terms of how it's kind of reduced some congestion around the city. And Bogota is probably one of the larger cities that doesn't have any sort of major heavy rail system. And so that kind of became brought into thought as kind of a lower, kind of a budget, practical problem solving solution there.
Yeah. The Transmilenio you mentioned is BRT, bus rapid transit, and
Yes.
It's often pointed to in a similar way that Portland for light rail. BRT advocates often point to Bogota's system as sort of the benchmark and,
Genesis, kind of, yeah.
And the example of how it can be successfully implemented in some other city, wherever they're discussing. And I just wanted to mention, tying this all together now, one of the head planners or designers of the BRT system in Bogota is or used to be a very, very, very frequent contributor to Metrojax. And I think he's been struggling with some health issues more recently, so I don't know if he's still as active as he used to be, but he has a wealth of knowledge that he's shared on Metro Jacksonville's website. So so tying it back to the original, how we started off the video, I guess.
Of course, yeah. So, well, thank you guys for sticking with us through this. And again, I hope you got some insight, and hopefully, follow up if you have some ideas for us on people we should check out or we don't know about. And if you check out any of these people and their content, let us know what you think.
Sounds good. Always nice talking to you, Chuck.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.